Good morning, everyone. We are on chapter 17, and so we're going to start in a few minutes. While everyone's getting on, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some notes that have been real helpful for me. If you really want to get into how I know a lot of the things that I'm talking about, but that y'all hadn't read. So his name is Dr. Constable, and I believe you can just Google his name. It's the first thing that comes up when I Google it. I think it's called Sonic Light. Is the website, but he was a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's retired now, and he was also a pastor of a church. And during his life, he has written his own commentaries on every book of the Bible, and Matthew alone is 500 pages, and it's full of notes, and he wrote it for his students and his Sunday school class, and so it's written in lay terms. It's not deep, it's not scholarly, and so it's real easy to understand. It's just a lot of information, so you don't have to read through it all, but if you're reading something and you don't, you know, maybe you want to know more than your commentary's giving you, if you go, he'll probably have 2 pages just on that one verse. And so a lot of good background stuff. His name's Dr. Constable. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We are at 10 people, it says. And people are joining on. So, Dr. Constable, and that's really, besides the commentaries that I have shared with y'all, I use him. And then there is a pastor that I listen to that also he has taught every book of the Bible chapter by chapter for Sunday mornings at his church or Wednesday nights. And so you can go to his website. His name is Jon Courson, Joncourson. And he is a pastor in Oregon. And I will listen to his sermons a lot too, just to get some extra information. So anyway, that's that. We are going to go through chapter 17, and it is called the Transfiguration, or the beginning of it is. And we are literally going to go pretty much verse by verse for the Transfiguration, and then we'll talk about the rest shortly. So we're going to go ahead and get started and dig in. Good morning. So, if you'll open your Bibles and read with me, in chapter 17, verse 1, it says, "After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and his brother John, and led them up on the high mountain by themselves." So, very beginning, where Matthew has indicated a number of days. After 6 days, scholars have agreed that this is to show the rapid development of his plan. Like before, they were just going along. He would give them little nuggets here and there. But now the plan is rapidly happening. And in fact, in chapter 21, we are going to begin the whole Passion Week. From 21 till the end of the book is going to all take place in 1 week. So we are at the end of Jesus's life here. Peter, James, and John are often referred to by scholars as Jesus's inner circle. He had the 12, but then you can't have that close, tight, intimate relationship with 12 people, but usually a few of those, a handful, are going to be your closest friends out of a group. Peter, James, and John seem to be who Jesus spent most of his time with. I read something yesterday by Dr. Constable that said, not that he loved them more, but that they were the best prepared and the most receptive of his message, and so he tended to spend that extra time to give them that extra information. And then you are going to see when you read the Gospel of John, John refers to himself every time as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so we believe that he had that extra special relationship with John. It's also believed that John was the youngest of all the disciples, so he was literally just a little boy during this time. So he has his inner circle with him, and he brings them to the mountain. I've looked through different commentaries, and no one agreed on what mountain it was. I don't think anyone knows for sure. And let's see, and it says, "He was transformed in front of them, and his face shone like the sun. Even his clothes became as white as the light. Suddenly, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him." So, We're going to go back to Peter, James, and John being the inner circle. 3 times during Matthew, he specifies that they were separated from the group for a little bit extra teaching with Jesus. The first time we saw it with Jairus's daughter. And remember, he was the one that, his daughter was dead by the time that they got there. And this was to show these 3 men that there is victory over death, because Jesus went and said she's not dead, and everybody laughed at him, and she's just sleeping. And so there's power and victory over death. You see that Jesus separated these 3 here at the Transfiguration, and that's to show that there is glorification through death. Christ is going to be glorified through his death. And then we're going to see later in the chapter, he takes these 3 men alone into the Garden of Gethsemane with him. And that is to show them that their submission in death. And he is going to submit to that. And so there's some lessons in death that these 3 men needed to learn. And we're going to talk about why for a second. Peter is going to be the first disciple that Jesus warns that he is going to die. We see this in John chapter 21. At the end, after Jesus has died and resurrected, he meets with them and they have some conversations, and he tells Peter that he's going to die. Peter doesn't like that, points to John, and it's like, well, what about him? And that had to have been a hard thing to hear and to swallow. And we later find out that Peter is crucified upside down on a cross. James is going to be the first out of all of these guys to die. And I think I had said last week that I thought he was crucified. I'd read there's different theories, but I had done a little more digging, and it's one of the ways that it's believed that he died was also by being sawed in half long ways. And so we don't exactly know 100% for sure. It doesn't record it, I guess, in the Bible, or I hope that I'm right about that. I haven't found it, but historians disagree, but they all agree on one thing, that it was horrible and gruesome. And so he was the first to die. And then John is going to be the last to die. He's going to be boiled in a cauldron of oil, and that's still not going to kill him. And so he's going to be exiled at an old age on the island of Patmos. So he's in total isolation. All of his friends are going to be gone, passed away, and there he's going to spend his last days writing Revelations. So very lonely, very difficult. So these 3 guys needed this lesson on death. And so then we see that there are some guys with Jesus. There's Moses and Elijah. Moses represents the law, because that's who God gave the law to. And Elijah was known to this group of people as the greatest of all prophets. And so here we have the law and the prophets with Jesus. Both of these men, Moses and Elijah, had intimate encounters with God on mountains. In fact, they both had it on Mount Sinai, just like Jesus is having this intimate encounter with his 3 disciples. And then Moses, there's a lot of similarities between the transfiguration with Jesus shining, everything was radiant and glowing, and that is how Moses' face was when he would go and meet with God face to face. In fact, he would put a veil over his face because the glory of God would reflect off of his face, and it was so bright that people couldn't look at him. But the difference here is that Jesus doesn't have God's glory reflecting off of him. He is glory, and so it's reflecting out of him. And then Moses has 3 people at one time with him on the mountain. And so there's a lot of symbolism and similarities there. And the word transfiguration comes from the word metamorphosis. And we think of a caterpillar and a butterfly, where literally God has taken one thing and through a series of events turned it into completely something different. And that's what Jesus was doing here. And a lot of places I read that this is his post-resurrection body, but he looked different. He was changed in form when the disciples saw him. And this was all for their benefit. They needed this experience with God with Jesus, because they are about to go through something horrific with him, but then it's going to be their responsibility to go and share this good news with the rest of the world. So this whole transfiguration on the mountain is for the benefit of the disciples. It's going to show them that it's going to encourage them to be to strengthen their faith, showing them that death will not be final. So that is exciting. So we get to where Peter ends up talking for the group, and he says, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you want, I will make 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." So I kind of was curious about what this tabernacle thing was. And so I looked up in Constable's notes, and he said that this is probably talking about the booth that was made, or sukkah. I put a picture of that up earlier. And this was a booth that was made during the Feast of Tabernacles. It's also sometimes called the Feast of Booths. But there were 3 feasts that in this culture that required you to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast. So during these times, Jerusalem grew, or was jammed packed with people. It was insane. It was crazy. It would go up to about 3 million people from about, I don't have in these notes. I'll tell you that in a couple of weeks when we're going to talk about this more in depth. But this festival or Feast of Tabernacles was one of those where you made this pilgrimage. And then when you got there, you made this sukkah, which is a small, hastily built hut, which meals are eaten throughout the 8-day festival. It's used to remember the huts made in Israel during the 40 years of wandering through the wilderness. And it happens in the fall, and it's to acknowledge thanks to God for all that he had done to get them from the wilderness and into the promised land. So they made these little huts, and that's what Peter is talking about here. Should I build one of those? And then just to share a little bit more, to foreshadow something coming, you used the booth for 7 days, and during those times you went to the temple carrying a fruit tree that represents the promised land, because it was the land flowing with milk and honey. It was fertile. You carried a fruit tree in, and a lulaw. And a lulaw is, stay with me, is made from palm branches, myrtles, and willows tied together with a golden thread. And when you got to the temple during the service, you would wave the lulaw made of palm branches, and you would recite a prayer called Hashanos, where each phrase was ended with Hosanna, please save it. Please save us. So I was reading this and studying, and I thought, well, this sounds like Palm Sunday. So I did some digging, and this is the feast that is going on during Palm Sunday. That's why they're all in the streets with their lulaws, or their palm branches. So we're going to talk more in depth about this feast on chapter 21, where Jesus comes in the triumphal entry. So while Peter is saying, hey, can I make these huts for y'all? This is going to be great. I love this next part in verse 5 where it says, while he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said. So God just totally interrupts Peter. He's one that always talks. Whatever's in his mind, he says. And sometimes it doesn't even make any sense, or he gets ahead of himself, and God just interrupts him and says, "This is my beloved son. I take delight in him. Listen to him." So this is, in case these 3 guys had any doubt that Jesus was the Messiah, I think they walked away that day with a firm grasp, and they will never forget, and it's etched in their mind and their memories forever, that Jesus is God's son. And what an amazing experience. And so, they ended up becoming terrified, and Jesus touched them, said, "Don't be afraid." But I want to point this out. Jesus says, "Don't tell anyone about the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." So this is going to be the last time. We've seen this all through the chapter where Jesus healed people or did something and said, "Don't tell anyone." This is going to be the last time he says, "Don't tell." From here on out, it is going to be for Pharisees and scribes to know. Their anger is going to be growing, and they are going to start plotting and killing. And so that is the triumphal entry. They do have a conversation about Elijah, how he was supposed to come. That's part of prophecy. And Jesus says, well, that was John the Baptist. Not that that was a reincarnation of Elijah, but he he was a representation of Elijah in a new person, but he was very similar, and we talked about that in chapters past. And so then when Jesus comes back, the rest of the disciples have been trying to cast out a demon from a boy, and they haven't been successful. And this whole lesson has to do on their faith. And so this boy had seizures, was throwing himself into the fire. The disciples couldn't heal him, and Jesus kind of goes off on him. He says, "You unbelieving and rebellious generation, how long will I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring him to me." So he gets aggravated because, my goodness, they have seen all these miracles. They've been with him. He's told them promises. He's shared things with them. They've had lessons from the parables, and they still don't have the faith that it takes. And it's the faith of a mustard seed. It doesn't take a lot of faith, but they still don't have that to cast this demon out. So then he goes in and says, if you have the faith of a mustard seed and tell this mountain, move from here into there, it will be moved. Nothing will be impossible for you. This kind will only come out with prayer and fasting. So I do want to talk about that slogan, or that saying about removing a mountain, because we're going to see this again. This was a proverbial figure of speech in this day and time. And so we're just going to see this again. And then with prayer and fasting, there are some things in our life that we have to deny our flesh. So that's fasting. And we're going to have to cleave to Jesus and align our spirits with him. And so we have to deny and we have to align through prayer. So these things go hand in hand. Fasting is denying our flesh. Prayer is aligning our flesh with God. So we want to do that. Then Jesus goes on and talks one more time about his death and is pretty clear about what's going to happen. And I think it was self-explanatory. And then I want to talk our last few minutes about this temple tax. They end up in Capernaum, and they get approached. Jesus and Peter get approached about paying this temple tax. This was not the Roman tax that the Jews hated the tax collectors for collecting for the Romans. This was a Jewish tax that males from 20 to 50 years old had to pay, and it was to upkeep, it was for temple maintenance, to upkeep the temple. And one story, or one thing to learn from this is how we kind of get the disciples' ages, because we know Jesus is about 30, and then this is how we know Peter has to be at least 20. It's believed by a lot of scholars he's 21, because he is asked to pay the temple tax too. None of the other disciples are, so we know that they're younger than that. And then Jesus performs a miracle here, and he has a lesson. It's a lesson to teach Peter, once again, who he is. He says that should the sons of kings have to pay their tax? And of course, no, the sons don't have to pay taxes to the land. And Jesus is saying, well, I'm the Son of God. I don't really need to do this. And you, being a follower of Christ, become the Son of God. You don't need to either. But we're going to pay it so that we don't offend some people and opposition set in. But this whole discussion between Peter and Jesus was just a lesson, again, to show that they are sons of the Creator God. And so we filled up our time today, but I love the transfiguration. It's a fun lesson. Chapter 18 is going to be a good lesson on how we deal with other believers who are in sin and have fallen away. So that is going to be a good talk. And then we're just getting closer and closer to Jesus's last week. And I hope and pray that even though the story is familiar with you and you've read it and we know it, we talk about it at Easter every year, I hope that going through it this slowly and dissecting it will open up something new in your heart. And I just want to say, have a good day. See you Thursday. Bye.